I first discovered Harold and Maude in 2021, back when I was convinced I was supposed to have been born in the mid-1950s and not the mid-1980s. And after watching it, I was extremely upset by the ending, and to this day, the more I've thought about it, the more the ending and the story overall just does not sit right with me. So Harold and Maude is a 1970 romantic black comedy about a suicidal 20-year-old boy and an 80-year-old manic pixie dream girl. Harold is preoccupied with suicide and killing himself and stages a bunch of attempts to get attention from his mother. His mother is comically rich and lives in a grand mansion that Harold also lives in, and as Harold seems to spend all his time crafting elaborate suicide attempts that his mother is no longer paying attention to, she decides that the solution is for him to get married, because that will make this 20-year-old boy a man. Meanwhile, Harold spends all his free time going to random people's funerals because he's a 1970s emo boy with a preoccupation and fixation on death. And at one of these funerals, he meets an equally random 80-year-old woman named Maude, who also is not related to anyone at this funeral. Maude takes a special interest in Harold and begins following him around until he starts paying attention to her. And then the two of them go back to her place, and they start spending a lot more time together. And Harold finds out that he really likes her, and that affection toward her as a friend eventually blossoms into a romantic attraction for this woman who could be his grandmother. Or maybe great-grandmother, if each generation is only 20 years apart. But anyways, and by the end of the movie, he wants to marry her and proposes to her. And spoiler alert, she dies, actually. And the irony is that she dies by her own hand. She overdoses on pills, and they kill her. Because her original plan from the very beginning, before she even met Harold, was to kill herself at 80. And throughout the movie, the whole theme seems to be sparking a new love and zest for life. Maude teaches Harold that once he stops following the rules, once he starts doing things for the spur of the moment, once he starts living for himself and his own pleasure, regardless of whether that inconveniences anyone around him, kind of the 1960s way, very 1960s of this movie, Maude teaches him that once he stops caring about other people, life can actually be worth living. But the irony is that Maude is living every day like it's her last when she is basically 1 week before dying, when she has already planned this suicide. Harold has barely started out on his adult life. And while the theme of this movie seems to be about, again, living for the pleasure of the moment, living for yourself and not caring about the rules of society or other people's expectations, the true joy that comes from Harold in this movie, that comes from Maude and Harold doing all these things in this movie, is that they're doing them together. A lot of these things wouldn't be as enjoyable if Maude were just doing them alone, and especially if Harold were just doing them on his own. Harold seems to enjoy the fact that another person has taken a special interest in him and is showing him all these cool new things, as Maude is doing, and that's why he ends up falling in love with her. Now, a couple things that bother me about this movie are, number one, the age gap, and number two, the ending. So, I think the age gap, it's supposed to be a point of comedy because, realistically, no 20-year-old man would be attracted to an 80-year-old woman without probably some trauma-induced fetish. But I think what bothers me is that Harold is extremely emotionally stunted, inexperienced, and immature, and Maude has so many more lifetimes of experience than Harold, and her relationship with him, the way she kind of aggressively pursues him until he becomes so attached to her that he can't let her go, to me, it feels a little bit too much like grooming. And now granted, she doesn't seem to want to use him for sexual favors. That seems to kind of happen naturally, maybe, and he is a legal adult, but again, if the roles were reversed and it were an 80-year-old man and 20-year-old girl, we would all be disgusted. And also, at the end of the day, a 20-year-old is very emotionally impressionable and easily moldable, as Harold is throughout the course of the movie. So again, it's difficult to look at this relationship as something that happened naturally when, again, Harold did not seem interested in Maude from the beginning until she started love bombing him, basically. Their dynamic always made me quite uncomfortable. You could call me too sensitive, but Like, you're talking to somebody who actually has an incredibly high tolerance and has always had an incredibly high tolerance for these things. I'm just telling you things that are jumping out to me, because their dynamic does not feel as organic as a man and woman just becoming attracted to each other naturally. The second thing that bothers me so much about the movie is the ending, when Maude, who has basically become Harold's reason for living, commits suicide. She has spent the entire movie teaching Harold that he should enjoy living, that he should seize living by the horns and grab it with a passion. And there's a scene where Harold is confessing to Maude that he has never felt like his parents have shown him any attention. And it wasn't until his mother thought he had died in a boarding school chemistry accident that she finally seemed to care about him, or there was this almost cinema to her grief. And then he begins crying and says that's when he realized he enjoyed being dead, because that's the only time his mother seemed to care about him, and that's why he's become obsessed with attempting suicide and trying to get his mother's attention so that his mother finally pays attention to him. And Maude basically tells him that there's so much more to life than being dead, and convinces him that, life is something worth cheering for, that he needs a cheerleader in order to stay alive, or, he needs to think of life as a sport for which she can be a cheerleader. She kind of becomes this cheerleader in the sport of life, and then she kills herself. She doesn't just die, she kills herself, and then we're just supposed to expect that now Harold, who has now developed this passion for life that is totally strong enough to stand on its own, is now now no longer feels depressed and is now going to enjoy his life. That doesn't make sense to me. I think the only logical ending to this movie is for Harold to kill himself, actually kill himself, because his girlfriend just commits suicide after convincing him that life is worth living. She was basically his last straw, and the main person he was relying on to stay alive, and then she was a total hypocrite when she told him how much life was worth living. But the only reason she was living life with such zest is because it was her final days. And Harold can't live like that. He would have to live with the consequences of his actions as a young adult. So the ending just didn't make sense to me. Killing herself felt like the cruelest thing that Maude could have done. I don't think she should have been responsible for Harold's emotional well-being, but she did kind of force her way into becoming Harold's sole emotional well-being. And that's why I was never able to like Maude. She always stuck out to me as a creep and just a terrible, selfish person. And that's why I think that Harold and Maude is so much darker of a movie than one can expect. It's a really dark movie for a comedy, and that's what makes it a black comedy. But to me, who obviously takes films way too seriously, otherwise I wouldn't have all these videos on my channel, the ending just makes no sense whatsoever, and it's almost dangerous, because a normal response that somebody like Harold would have to somebody like Maude killing herself would be to kill himself too. That would just simply make more sense. It really doesn't make sense that he spends the beginning of the movie being suicidal until a woman in his life gives him a passion for life, and then she leaves it the same way she told him not to. And now he's just happy and willing to grab life by the horns. So yeah, the movie doesn't make sense. Check it out. I think it's free on Vimeo. And let me know your thoughts, or if you know of any other old vintage movies that have subtly darker themes than they let on. Okay, bye!